Hello there everyone. Now we're gonna dig deep into the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. And we'll begin with one of his first major works, and it is called The Birth of Tragedy. The Birth of Tragedy, or Geburt der Tragödie, is a big analysis of ancient Greek philosophy, music and art. Because according to Nietzsche, the way the ancient Greeks looked at life was fundamentally different than ours. It's a pretty short book and probably one of his least famous ones, but I rather enjoyed it. And at least this show is supposed to be a philosophy and music show. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this one.
A funny thing about this book is that 16 years after its publication, during his time in Sils Maria, Nietzsche wrote a stinging critique of his own book, which is now added to most of its new publications. And in the critique, Friedrich is really hard on his younger self, and you almost get the feeling that he is regretting ever publishing it. And one is almost tempted to stop reading after the critique.
But to hell with that, I say, because in some ways this is the very foundation of the whole of Nietzsche's philosophy. He constantly comes back to this concept of the Greek tragedy. First, I think we need to clarify what an authentic Greek tragedy is. Because for the Greeks, the tragedy is not just a sad story.
The earliest account on the origin of the tragedy do we get from Aristotle, although the golden age of tragedy is supposed to take place 200 years before him.
The tragedy was usually part of a big festival in praise of the god Dionysus. And it usually began with what is called a dithyramb, a hymn and a dance in the Phrygian mode.
Phrygian mode? I think you need to explain that one further.
Okay, so in our Western tradition, our music is usually based upon the major scale. And another name for the major scale is the Ionian scale. And if I only play white notes beginning on C, it will sound like this. And there we have the major scale. But if I would only play white notes beginning on E instead, it sounds like this. And there we have the Phrygian scale, or the Phrygian mode. So a dithyramb would sound something maybe like this. So back to Leipzig. And then the plays would begin. And usually it was divided into 4 parts, a tetralogy, 3 tragic plays, and then 1 comical conclusion in the end. And one play could last for hours, so the whole festival lasted for 3 whole days. What is significant for a tragedy is that usually something horrible will happen to the main character of the story. And whatever this character does, he won't be able to prevent it. So it has an element of determinism in it. And if you remember, the Greeks didn't believe in free will.
Take the play Oedipus by Sophocles, for example. Oedipus's father consulted the oracle of Delphi, and they prophesied that he would be killed by his own son. When he heard this, and his wife being pregnant, he did everything in his power to prevent this fate from happening. And spoilers, he was later slain by his son Oedipus, and Oedipus later married his mother. hence the name Oedipus complex by Sigmund Freud.
So, what is the point of a tragedy? Why would you want to watch something that ends terribly for the hero in the story? Would you rather just watch a Marvel movie where the hero saves the world and gets the girl in the end?
For Friedrich and for the Greeks, there was a ton of wisdom hidden inside the tragic story. Here Nietzsche writes, "The metaphysical consolation with which, as I am immediately indicating here, every true tragedy leaves us that, in spite of all transformations in phenomena, at the bottom of everything, life is indestructibly powerful and delightful. This consolation appears in lively clarity as the course of satyrs, as the course of natural beings who live, so to speak, indestructibly behind all civilization, and who, in spite of all the changes in generations and a people's history, always remain the same."
In the book, Nietzsche makes a distinction between two very separate ways of looking at art, and they are based on two different Greek deities, Apollo and Dionysus. And also, these two symbolizes two different ways of looking at life as well.
Dionysus, the Greek god of wine and pleasure, but also music and tragedy. He is the son of a priestess of Zeus named Semele, and by Zeus himself. Zeus was married to Hera, but according to the myth, he had a great lust for anything he thought was pretty. Hera got incredibly jealous of Zeus's relationship to Semele, so she tricked her by putting her in doubt whether the man Semele is meeting really is Zeus. So Semele forced Zeus to show his true form as a god, which results in Semele's immediate death. Zeus falls in despair, but he manages to save their son, who was still alive in Semele's womb, Dionysus.
So Dionysus became the god of not just wine and pleasure, but also music. The Romans called him Bacchus, and he is a big symbol of intoxication, music, and ecstasy.
And then we have Apollo. Apollo was another son of Zeus, and he was twin brother of Artemis. Apollo was the god of dreams, mathematics, reason, and logic, but just like Dionysus, god of music. There is a very interesting story where Apollo challenges the satyr Marsyas to a musical duel, ending with Apollo winning and flaying Marsyas alive for losing. The Greek gods are not famous for their benevolence.
So both these two deities share a passion for music, but in two very different ways, since Apollo being the god of logic and reason, and Dionysus of lust and feeling.
Nietzsche writes, "In order to bring those two drives closer to us, let us think of them first as the separate artistic worlds of dream and of intoxication, physiological phenomena between which we can observe an opposition corresponding to the one between the Apollonian and the Dionysian."
At the time, Nietzsche was heavily influenced by the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, and to Schopenhauer, the whole world is merely an illusion of the real world, or the thing in itself. So whenever one composes a piece of painting or writes a book, one is merely making a copy of the illusion. So in a way, it's an illusion of an illusion.
But this is not the case with music. Music is not a copy of a representation of the world. It is the phenomena itself. Here Schopenhauer writes in his book, The World as Will and Representation. For music is, as mentioned, different from all other arts in this sense. It is not a portrayal of appearances, or more correctly, the adequate objectification of the will, but the immediate portrayal of the will itself, as well as the metaphysical complement of all physical things in the world and the thing in itself of all appearances. We could therefore call the world the embodiment of music just as much as the embodiment of the will.
The world being an embodiment of music. Fascinating stuff, right? But well, later Nietzsche expands on the dualism between Apollo and Dionysus to be not just about music and art, but they carry with them two very separate philosophies.
I would say that we nowadays most of the time relate to the spirit of Apollo, logic, reason, science and truth. But Nietzsche think that we have lost something when we solely spend time with Apollo. Dionysus and the tragedy is gone.
The spirit of Dionysus was very important for the ancient Greeks. But in the 4th century BC, one man will come to change everything. A man we've already talked about in depth on this show, namely Socrates.
We have already talked quite a bit about Socrates in the first episode on Kierkegaard. But one interesting thing is that Nietzsche analyzed Socrates in a completely different manner than Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard loved Socrates, and Nietzsche loathed him.
For Nietzsche, Socrates really was the beginning of a philosophy of truth and knowledge. If you remember, he walked around in Athens exposing ordinary people's ignorance.
These people were simply acting and thinking intuitively, and along came the logician Socrates, ruining their intuition. He urged them to find out the truth, the proper state of things, questioning their intuition. Here Nietzsche says, but the most pointed statement about that new and unheard of high opinion of knowledge and understanding was uttered by Socrates, when he claimed that he was the only person to assert that he knew nothing, whereas in his critical wandering about in Athens, conversing with the greatest statesmen, orators, poets and artists, everywhere he ran into people who imagined they knew things. Astonished, he recognized that all these famous people in themselves had no correct and clear insight into their careers and carried out their work only instinctually, only from instinct. With this expression, we touch upon the heart and center of the Socratic attitude.
So Nietzsche clearly isn't a fan of Socrates. He even thinks that Socrates was the killer of the Greek tragedy and the killer of a whole way of life. There's a part of the book where Nietzsche just trash-talking Socrates, and you can almost hear his anger when you're reading it.
Let people merely recall the consequences of the Socratic sayings. Virtue is knowledge. Sin arises only from ignorance. The virtuous person is the happy person. In these three basic forms of optimism lies the death of tragedy.
So here was a big shift in Western society, the death of tragedy. Because according to Nietzsche, the tragedy was a big affirmation of life, a yes to life, even though it is tragic. But along came Socrates, ruining it all. Because according to him, the only way of living a virtuous life is through knowledge. Ignorance is sin.
As we have said before, Socrates didn't write anything, but his student, Plato, expanded on his ideas and made sure Socrates' thoughts would be remembered. And for Nietzsche, this is where the decay of Western society began, because out of it came Christian morality. He even says that Christianity is Platonism for the people.
Fast forward to the 19th century. Nietzsche saw that during his time, Christianity was crumbling. So this was probably the perfect moment for a rebirth of the tragedy. And he could see exactly that in his friend Richard Wagner's music. And Nietzsche wanted to lay down the philosophical foundation of a new kind of philosophy. So Nietzsche, according to himself, was the first new, real Dionysian philosopher. That's it for today, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this episode. More and more is to come. This is just the beginning.